All right, welcome to another deep dive. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff.
Yeah,
A lot of it centered around this third eye of knowledge transfer.
right. By Shiva Narayan Taxfila Page.
That's right. And today, we're going to be focusing on two of the most important concepts from the material you sent. How do we actually learn and understand new things?
Yeah.
And what is this definition spectrum all about?
Right, and you said a lot of different kinds of stuff.
Right.
We got stuff about how the brain works, some different ideas about classrooms and how they could be structured.
Right. We're going to sort of try to pull out some of the main threads here
Yeah.
and hopefully give you some interesting ideas to think about.
Exactly.
So let's start with this definition spectrum. It
Yeah.
comes up a lot.
Right. It's a key idea in all this.
And it's even referred to as a third eye of learning.
Right.
So what is this whole definition spectrum thing about?
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting is this contrast that the text draws with what it calls fixed period teachings, right?
Okay.
So think about it this way. Instead of just getting one standard explanation of something at a certain time,
Right.
the definition spectrum is all about exploring the full range of possible meanings or definitions. And ideally, the text really emphasizes that this should start with a really comprehensive source, what they call a mother book.
Okay.
So the idea is that this broader way of exploring a topic will lead to a much, much richer and more personalized understanding.
So, I mean, it sounds like it's about going beyond just the first answer you get, right? Like if you're reading about, let's say, a historical event,
Right.
it's not just about getting that sort of textbook summary, but really trying to understand different interpretations, the context of the times, what the long-term consequences were, just that kind of breadth of understanding.
Absolutely. And, the text makes a really interesting leap here. It suggests a possible link to how our brains work. It proposes that students who are really high performing, they're engaging with and modulating a much, much wider definition spectrum in those areas of the brain that are responsible for making associations and connections.
Wow.
And it even hints at a connection between the scope of this knowledge spectrum of chapter brain and something like intelligence or IQ.
Wow. Okay.
Now, the text doesn't really elaborate on any sort of empirical basis for this claim,
Right.
but it does raise a very interesting question about the neurological correlates of understanding.
That's fascinating.
It really makes you wonder.
Yeah, so the idea is that the more angles, the more context we can hold in our minds,
Right.
the deeper our understanding will be, and potentially the sharper our thinking.
That's the implication, absolutely.
Oh, okay. So we're building up this definition spectrum, and then the next thing that the text introduces is this brain page concept.
Yeah.
So maybe you can just sort of walk us through that a little bit. What is a brain page, and
Yeah.
what are these brain page modules supposed to be?
Yeah, so the text refers to a brain page of object definitions,
Right.
but also these brain page modules of knowledge spectrum.
Okay.
And I think the way I see it is it's almost like our brains are creating their own internal maps of information, right?
Right.
Where we're taking all these different definitions and related details, and we're sort of linking them all together in this kind of network.
Mm.
And the idea seems to be that the more we develop these interconnected modules, these brain page modules, the better our capacity for understanding becomes.
So it's kind of like
Almost like
building a mental folder.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And the more detail you have, the more you've fleshed it out,
Yeah.
the better your understanding.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The text actually suggests that if students become really good at building these brain page modules from, those fundamental definitions of things.
Right. Then traditional teaching, teaching as we know it might not even be entirely necessary.
Wow.
It actually proposes that learning is, quote, finished in brain page making process,
Okay.
which is really different from the usual way we think about it, right?
Right.
Where we assume that learning is something that happens because of teaching.
Right. That flips the script.
Exactly.
So now it's all about what's going on in the learner's head.
Precisely.
And there's also this term that comes up, cerebellar learnography.
Oh, yeah.
Is that connected to how these brain pages take shape
It's an interesting point.
or how they function?
The text does touch on cerebellar learnography,
Mhm.
and it sort of hints that the cerebellum, which is a part of the brain that we usually associate with, motor control and coordination,
Right.
might also be playing a role in the way that these brain page structures are, I guess you could say, automatized or refined over time.
Okay.
Now, the exact mechanisms aren't really spelled out here, But it does suggest that there might be a link between the cerebellum and our ability to just become more efficient learners, right?
Right.
Perhaps making those brain page connections more and more smoothly.
Okay, so we're building this internal brain page. We're exploring the definition spectrum.
Right.
But how does this translate to actually using knowledge?
Yeah.
Especially when we're outside of, a formal learning setting.
Well, that's where these ideas of definition address and naming address come into play.
Okay.
So the test explains that when you have these two things together, it forms what it calls a functional object of knowledge transfer.
Okay.
So the idea is that if you really understand what something is, that's the definition address,
Okay.
and you know what it's called, the naming address,
Right.
then you're going to be much, much better equipped to work with that knowledge, to use it, and to share it with other people.
Right. So you have the concept and then you have the label for it.
Exactly.
So that you can access it, you can communicate it.
Good.
Now, the text also talks about these two phases of education,
Yes.
the teaching phase and the learning phase.
Right.
What's the distinction there?
So basically, what the text is observing is that in a typical classroom setting, you've got these two distinct things happening, right?
Right, right,
So the teaching phase is the teacher.
right,
They're actively instructing, presenting the information.
right,
And then the learning phase is the student's role,
right,
listening, absorbing.
right.
And here's a really, really key point that the text makes. It says that, and I quote, book-to-brain knowledge transfer is not observed in the classrooms.
Wow. Okay, so if that direct transfer, from book to brain isn't really happening effectively in the classroom, where is it happening?
Well, the text really emphasizes home learning as that critical environment.
Okay.
This is where students are engaging with the material independently.
Right.
They're processing it in their own way.
Right.
And presumably, starting to build those brain page modules.
Right.
And it even goes so far as to suggest that parents could potentially become professional teachers to kind of guide this independent learning at home.
Interesting. So the idea is that maybe the classroom provides that initial spark, that introduction,
Right.
but the really deep learning, the internalizing, the understanding
Right.
really happens when the student sits down on their own and really engages with the material.
Absolutely.
Okay. So this brings us to learnography,
Yeah.
which is presented as this new way of thinking about learning.
Right. A new approach.
So what are some of the big ideas behind learnography?
Okay, well, learnography, as it's described in the text, is it's really an approach that emphasizes a couple of things. First, it focuses on applying knowledge in practical ways. Right?
Okay.
So not just, having the knowledge in your head, but really being able to use it.
Okay.
And the other thing it focuses on is the overall development of the learner.
Okay.
And, you're absolutely right. The definition spectrum idea that we talked about is crucial to this.
Okay.
So instead of passively receiving information, learnography really encourages students to go out and explore concepts
Oh.
by connecting them to their own experiences, to what they already know, to how those concepts can be used in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about building those personal contextual connections.
So it's not just about having definitions memorized in isolation.
Right.
It's about understanding how they relate to everything else that we know and everything that we've experienced.
Exactly.
Okay.
And, another really important aspect of learnography is that it emphasizes looking at concepts from, multiple dimensions and understanding them in terms of multiple interpretations.
Okay.
It encourages developing a multidimensional perspective.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, thinking critically by really considering different points of view.
Right.
So it's less about, just finding one right answer
Right.
and much more about understanding the richness and the complexity of an idea.
Okay. And what about the role of the individual student in learnography?
Well, the text really stresses the importance of what it calls subjectivity and personalization.
Okay.
So students are really encouraged to bring their own unique perspectives, their own insights to the learning process.
Okay.
And the idea is that, by incorporating their own experiences, their own affiliations, they're going to feel a much stronger sense of ownership over what they're learning,
Yep.
a much stronger connection to it.
Right.
And that, of course, can make learning much more motivating and much more effective.
Yeah. So it sounds like a much more active and tailored approach
Right.
compared to just sort of sitting there being lectured at.
Exactly.
Now, the text also mentions this idea of language evolution.
Yes.
How does learnography take that into account?
So learnography really recognizes that language is not static, right?
Right.
It changes, it evolves over time.
Right.
So students are encouraged to think about how words and concepts kind of adapt and take on new meanings in different situations. And this helps them see that knowledge isn't this fixed, unchanging thing,
Right.
but it's actually something that's constantly being shaped and redefined.
That's interesting. And, going back to how this feels for the learner, the text says that developing these brain page modules of definition spectrum can actually help build comfort and confidence in the learning process.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point.
How does that work?
Well, I think by encouraging this kind of exploration and engagement with a wide range of meanings,
Right.
learnography creates a more supportive learning environment
Okay.
where students are going to feel more comfortable expressing their thoughts, expressing their ideas without being afraid of, getting it wrong.
Right.
And I think this can go a long way in reducing anxiety around making mistakes,
Yeah.
and it helps to foster a growth mindset, right?
Right.
It encourages students to take risks, to really own their learning journey.
Yeah. Okay, learnography sounds like a pretty comprehensive approach.
It really is.
And then the text goes on to talk about some of the specific elements and systems within learnography,
Right?
including this zeid science of brain page processing.
Yes.
So, that sounds pretty technical.
It does.
What's that all about?
So the text describes these things called zeids as fundamental objects of cognitive knowledge.
Okay.
And I think it's helpful to think of zeids as these kind of fundamental atoms of knowledge, right?
Right?
So you can think of them as basic units of understanding that aren't necessarily single facts, but more like, core concepts that can combine and interact.
Okay.
And zeid science seems to be all about how these fundamental units of understanding are processed in the brain.
Okay.
And it places a lot of emphasis on what it calls their continuous motility, or their movement and interaction within our cognitive structures.
So they're not just sort of static.
Right.
They have to be active and interconnected in order for learning to happen.
Absolutely.
And then we have learnodynamics as well, which is described as dealing with dynamic brain-based learning objects.
Right.
So I guess that's sort of highlighting the fact that these things are active and changing within the brain.
That's exactly it. It's all about, the dynamic nature of how these knowledge elements exist within the brain,
Okay.
how they're constantly interacting and evolving.
And then we also have village learnography and chapter learnography.
Right.
So are those kind of different scales of learning?
I think so.
Hmm.
Yeah, village learnography is presented as, the most basic biological learning of these individual base objects. So, those fundamental building blocks of knowledge.
Okay.
It's almost like learning the individual vocabulary words of a language.
Okay.
Chapter learnography, on the other hand, is more about learning an entire subject matter as those interconnected brain page modules that we talked about.
Right.
So it's more like understanding how those vocabulary words come together to form sentences and convey meaning.
Okay, so you have the individual pieces, and then you have how they fit together to make a bigger picture.
Right, exactly.
Now, the text also talks about these base objects as being really crucial to knowledge transfer.
Yes.
And then it introduces this concept of the architecture of structured classroom
Right,
and this thing called a system modulator.
right.
So what's going on in that more controlled learning environment?
Well, in the structured classroom, the system modulator is described as something that, quote, observes the biology of learning brain and regulates the brain page processing of definition spectrum.
Okay.
So it uses logic points and zeid pathways to kind of, help guide this whole process.
Okay.
And the mother book is also mentioned here as containing these spectrum, definitions, and logical operations.
Okay.
So essentially, it's providing all the core resources for this, very intentionally designed learning environment.
So it's almost like an operating system for the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it.
And then we have two more terms here. Sensory learnograph and motor zeid graph,
Yes.
which are described as two states of knowledge transfer.
Right.
What's the difference between those two?
So the sensory learnograph is defined as, quote, the brain page of learning mechanism.
Okay.
So it's all about how we actually learn.
Right.
And then the motor zeid graph is defined by the objects of subject matter,
Okay.
which is essentially, what we learn.
Right.
So one is about the process
Right.
and one is about the content.
Right. So the how and the what of learning.
Precisely.
And finally, the text raises this question about how effective different kinds of classrooms, period teaching, demonstrative, collaborative, structured, self-directed learning, how effective they are at transfer learning.
Yeah, yeah.
So what's the significance of asking that question in this whole context?
I think, by raising that question, the text is suggesting that not all learning environments are created equal.
Right.
When it comes to helping students take what they've learned
Right.
and apply it in different situations.
Right.
And I think it challenges us to think about, what kinds of learning experiences
Right.
will really support that deep understanding in those robust brainpage modules
Right.
that allow for effective knowledge transfer.
Okay, so it all really comes back to this idea that understanding and writing are fundamentally about this modular mapping of knowledge chapters.
Yeah.
And if this brain page of definition spectrum isn't really developed or used,
Yeah,
then understanding is going to be a real challenge.
absolutely. And it underscores that this ability to really navigate and utilize the definition spectrum
Right?
is absolutely key to building a solid and a nuanced understanding of any topic.
Right.
Without that, it's really hard to make connections between different ideas to really grasp the complexities of something.
Right. Right. And that ability to develop our learning spectrum is also directly linked to our ability to understand what the text calls the question matrix,
Right.
which is necessary for solving problems.
Exactly.
So the idea is if we have a really rich, really flexible understanding of the underlying concepts,
Yeah.
then we're going to be much, much better at tackling complex problems, finding effective solutions.
Exactly. The depth and the breadth of our internal definition spectrum
Right.
is going to directly influence how good we are at, analyzing questions,
Right.
picking out the right information,
Right.
and coming up with good answers.
Okay, so to wrap this up, this deep dive into the material you sent, it seems like the core idea is the importance of the definition spectrum.
Right.
And this brain page concept
Yes.
as being central to this more profound and more personalized understanding of knowledge.
Right. And it really shifts the focus away from just passively absorbing information
Right.
towards, actively building understanding
Right.
within our own brains.
So it's not just learning facts, but it's this dynamic process of making those connections
Right.
and exploring that full range of meaning.
Absolutely.
So some questions for you, the listener, to think about.
Yeah.
As you think about your own learning experiences, what parts of this learnography approach,
Right.
particularly those ideas around the definition spectrum and how we build these brain page structures, what really resonates with you?
And how might consciously trying to explore a wider range of definitions change how you approach new information in the future?
And one final thought for you to consider.
If our brains are constantly building these knowledge spectrums,
Right.
how can we become more aware and more intentional about the quality of those structures?
Right. The connections within them, the architecture of it all.
Exactly.
Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.